Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is Let's Have Renaissance, a podcast about literature and the arts. I am Ito Otini.
And I'm Makaya Otini, and today we're speaking with Lesley Dill. For decades, Lesley has worked at the intersection of language, sculpture, printmaking, performance, and installation. She's had over 100 solo exhibitions, and her work is in the collections of many major museums, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Whitney Museum of Art, and MoMA. She's also received support from the Joan Mitchell Foundation, the Guggenheim Foundation, and the Emily Dickinson Museum. We're excited to be with her today.
Thank you for tuning in. We're excited that you're here. Why don't you also subscribe, like, comment, and share this episode with your friends?
And if you know anyone who wants to come on the podcast, please do send them our way. Also, if you haven't yet, sign up for our free newsletter where we share updates, resources, and opportunities. To support the podcast, you can make a one-time donation through our website or purchase a subscription to our blog where you'll find more premium content and resources at thedatekeepers.com. Thank you for being a part of our community.
Lesley, thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to have you. Can you tell us about yourself and what are you working on?
Thank you so much, Ito. Yes, I am speaking to you from my studio here in Brooklyn, New York. And it's a lovely, sort of chilly day here in New York. I grew up in Maine in a much more northern place in quiet, wild nature. Very dark and beautiful and cold, with deer and bears and hawks flying everywhere. But years later, in the 1990s, I lived in such a different place. I lived in India for 2 years with my husband, who was working there in New Delhi. And I couldn't really understand the Hindi that was spoken all around me every day in the temples, the streets, and especially the home. This was a new and vulnerable thing for me, to not understand a language. So I absorbed what I could absorb, and yet a funny thing happened. When the sense of language, the meaning of it was removed, the words actually became a kind of incantation. I had a studio there in New Delhi, and I wanted to try to make a visual equivalent of the melodic unintelligibility I was hearing every day. So, words to me are heated, intimate things. Words we hear scantly, we absorb lightly. Words we hear deeply through sound and meaning, we take in deep. And then there are the words we lose. We grow fat with language, and we can grow thin from language gone out of us. And what I realized with this lack of understanding and wanting to understand, I realized that we're all animals of language, no matter what we're speaking, that spoken words are not necessarily gridded and geometrically presented text, like on the computer or on a book or an iPad. So I realized that they are really heated, intimate things. Like this minute, in making the words that I'm speaking to you now, I have a thought, I take a breath, wrap that thought with breath, and I bring it up past my throat, my teeth, my tongue, my lips, out into the world, onto your faces, your skin, your arms, ears, your body. Therefore, no matter what language you're speaking, the most intimate imprint of the person speaking is on the air going into you. We know this is true because when the phone rings or buzzes and we bring it to our ear.
And how does that show in your work? Like, what is the relationship between language and image?
Well, I feel that the palpableness of language extends to the artwork in many different tactile ways. My great aunts taught me how to weave and do printmaking when I was 10 or 11, and You touch a thread, you feel the cloth, you touch a wire, you feel the weaving of it. In our lives, we touch softness, hardness, warmth, and in-betweenness. And as human beings with bodies and multiple sense organs, we have a huge range of taking in the world. We don't just take the world in like we're removed and watching a film with us outside the fishbowl. Actually, we are in it. We are like glasses of water floating in the ocean.
Was that experience in India how you realized that you wanted to express yourself through a visual medium or in a tactile medium, or were you already a working artist when you went to India? And if so, what was your work like that you were doing before, and how did it change due to this immersion experience?
The work I was doing before was, I think, generally sculptures and images of bodies of people, or arms, or legs, or hands. And living in New Delhi, India, coincided with something else. Because I was going to be gone for a long time, my mother sent me a book of Emily Dickinson language, her poetry. And I thought, whoa, this is a really big book. I don't think I'm ever going to really read it. But I opened it up and I just would glance at the poetry, and it was as if reading her words, it felt as if a bomb went off inside me. So phrases like, some too fragile for winter winds, and also to be alive is power, existence in itself without a further function, omnipotence enough. So right then, at that moment when I was reading, images for artworks would rise up. So I had meaning living inside me already. But it was upon reading her words in India that the feeling of meaning connected spontaneously in my psyche. I would look at a page, and before I knew it, words would jump up and be inside me. They were interacting on their own, and they were creating images. It was like drinking wine. Like 1 minute it's outside you, and the next minute it's inside you, and reactions are happening. So I thought I had found a magic book that was my own private farm as an artist finding images. This had never happened with other books that I read, that immediately some kind of image for art making would just jump up in my mind.
When you read Emily Dickinson now, do you find that your reading of her poems is colored by the initial reading and by the context you were in? And I'm asking this because there's a couple books that I read for the first time. Well, actually, not for the first time. There's a couple books that I read when I was in India that one of them I'd read it before, but it was a new experience reading it while I was in India. But those were books actually that take place in India. One was Arundhati Roy's The God of Small Things. Uh,
Oh, yeah.
One was Vikram Chandra's Red Earth and Pouring Rain.
Oh, I
And
read that.
yeah, and now whenever I read those books, my experience of them is more vital than I think it would have been.
Hmm.
And there's still some of the texts that make up my personal canon, but
Mhm.
I don't know if I would have had that same experience reading those books in another context or reading books that don't have a connection to India while I was in India.
Mhm.
And I'm curious because you had an experience that was similar, but with a book that doesn't have an immediate and obvious connection to India,
Mhm.
how that has played out over time and how it's shaped iterative readings of Dickinson's work. If you can elaborate on that, I would be curious to hear what you have to say.
I'm really interested in what you said about how when you were reading a book that was in a different country, there's something about having that happen in a place that was not your mother tongue, that it became special in some way. Is that a correct interpretation?
Yes, although in my case, I think it definitely is anchored in the fact that it's the same country.
Mm.
In the case of The God of Small Things, not the same region because I was in Hyderabad and
Oh, Hyderabad.
yeah, I visited Kerala briefly, and Red Earth and Pouring Rain, of course, much of it takes place in the historical and the mythic past. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not the same region, but it's the same general cultural context, and that vitalized my reading in a way that I know from having read Red Earth and Pouring Rain previously when I
Mm-hmm.
was in the US. I did not connect with that book, and other Americans that I've given that book to did not connect with it. And there was something about reading it in that context where
Mm-hmm.
I consider it one of my favorite books still.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if that effect would apply to any book in my case, or if it has to be one that has a connection to the context in which I'm reading it.
That's interesting because if we're in a context where we're relatively isolated from our normal life, whether it's good or bad or difficult or hard. There's still something special, I think, about that isolation. It can be scary, or it can give you safety and solace because you have connected to the words in the book that you are reading, and the words become your friends. I am quite shy and interior as a person, and I first started using language as clothing in my work, as a kind of protection,
Hmm.
as if the language that I was quoting, this artwork or that artwork, that it provided a mediating skin between myself and the world. And in that case, then clothing, the way I often use it in artwork, became something of an armor, an identity that, like words, selectively conceals and reveals.
A lot of people try to find their people, their
Mhm,
community. I am not
mhm,
that person. I don't have Moroccan community in the US, and I don't feel like, oh, I'm lacking something. Like if someone comes and we get along, then great. If
mhm.
not, I am very much integrated in the culture and make friends with everyone. Did you seek Americans when you were there? Especially with the language, with the fact that you didn't speak Hindi, or were you just on your own? Like, how did you survive the 2 years?
Well, my husband had a job working there. He was working with NIIT. He did a video project working with the farmers in the Rohtak area of Delhi. So there was the American embassy that was there. So first, when we arrived in India, of course, I would go to parties that they did, and it was really interesting for me because there were people from so many different kinds of backgrounds. And then over the 2 years, bit by bit, I met more and more people who were Indian and also who are artists or poets or filmmakers. So I found my own people through the process of my work, really.
You've talked about this experience of finding yourself in an environment that's new and different and immersive in a startling way.
Mhm.
You said you grew up in the forest and now you're living in New York. What was your first experience of moving to an urban metropolitan area like?
Well, my first experience of moving to New York City was really surprising to me because I loved it. I immediately loved it. I felt like we were all here and we were all looking for something and we were looking for the other people who were looking for something. So, to my surprise, I mean, this is not a peaceful escape here in New York City. And still, today, I still love it. When I did my opera on Emily Dickinson, I wanted to find a poem that was the darkest poem. And I didn't choose death, I chose loneliness.
Hmm.
Let me see if I can remember even one line of it. I can look it up in a second, but it's "The loneliness one dare not sound." It's a wonderful poem. I could open it in a second, but it's about how you can't even admit to yourself that you're lonely, that you're so lonely that if you were to acknowledge that you were lonely, you would be even more lonely.
Well, there's a difference between loneliness and isolation.
True.
I always think about languages and
I
words
think that
Mhm,
and their
to
meaning.
to underscore the distinction, maybe solitude versus isolation.
Yeah, but also, like, I am very sociable, but I don't like being in big groups. I don't
yeah.
like being in conversations that are not intellectual because I
Mhm,
grew up questioning everything,
mhm,
being, I think, forced by the circumstances to think and
mhm,
reflect. And I don't
mhm,
know how to relate to people who don't reflect. I tried many
mhm,
times. I tried at the human rights world where I worked
mhm.
at a full time job, and I just don't know how to relate to simple things.
Mhm. Actually, maybe this would be applicable. So, for me growing up in Maine, which was dark and peaceful and beautiful, but actually it was not so peaceful. There were good things, like my mother was my speech and drama teacher at high school, and she gave me an understanding of speaking in public and the idea of theater, and without that sense of theater, I doubt I would have conceived and directed an opera. But my dad gave me a different sense of language because I'll say it in this way, he spoke in a magical language, but he was paranoid schizophrenic, and he had many special words and phrases and objects that had 4 or 5 or 6 different personal and urgent and secret meanings. And as a child growing up inside the family, I could see that he heard things differently than other people. So here we are talking, and I think already we have an agreed upon surface meaning of a word like, for example, India, or talking or reading. But an example for him is the words to go. Those are simple 2 words like to go. But no, for him, there would be his secret meaning of these words. And he knew I understood as a child. He knew I understood, and I knew that he knew that I understood. And he would slant his language towards me. So I feel like I grew up in a psychologically bilingual family. So for me now, words exist naturally in duplicate, triplicate, quadruplicate. Like there's an inherent meaning, there's a secret meaning, and there's a surface meaning.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So when you moved to New York, do you think that you were using that new environment in the same way that you were using the coded language in your works of art as a type of armor, as something to put between yourself and the world?
Definitely. I was using language and reading, and then putting that language and reading into my work. It made me feel very comfortable because I even just like seeing different fonts, different sizes, especially poetry. I mean, there are other words that are not so appealing, like, say, Burger King.
It is. Come on, like fries and all of it.
Or even like the
Even
idea
word
of it.
is really appealing.
Well, because I was so interested in the affect of language. I was driving for some talk, and I saw this huge Burger King, and all I could imagine was like an enormous figure with a crown that was completely made out of raw hamburger. And that was so distasteful to me, who loves words. So anyway, there's that.
Would you like to read the poem you mentioned before?
I would. I'm not going to read The Loneliness. If I may, I'm going to read The Soul Has Bandaged Moments.
Okay.
Sure.
It's a beautiful, intense poem. So I think from what we've talked about, it's applicable. So here she goes. The soul has bandaged moments when, too appalled to stir, she feels some ghastly fright come up and stop to look at her. Salute her with long fingers. Caress her freezing hair. Sip, goblin, from the very lips the lover hovered o'er, unworthy that a thought so mean accost a theme so fair. The soul has moments of escape when, bursting all the doors, she dances like a bomb abroad. And again, this is Dickinson in the 1800s. She dances like a bomb abroad and swings upon the hours, as do the bee delirious born, long dungeoned from his rose. Touch liberty, then know no more but noon in paradise. The soul's retaken moments, when felon led along, with shackles on the plumed feet and staples in the song. And she closes with this. She goes back to horror. The horror welcomes her again. These are not braid of tongue. It's not an amazing poem because it's about the lover being a goblin who sips from the very lips, and also the soul has moments of escape. I mean, I don't know. And the fact that the soul has bandaged moments, I think that's very true.
That's wonderful.
Thank you very much for this conversation.
Yeah, our pleasure. We enjoyed having you.
Same. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.